Welcome back. Coming up next, we'll look at the moments when we've tried to control the animal world and got it horribly wrong. First, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Intelligence officials have said North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ordered the killing of his half-brother Kim Jong-nam. South Korean lawmakers made the announcement following a briefing by their country's intelligence agency. Samsung's heir apparent, Lee Jae-yong, is to be formally indicted on multiple charges, including bribery and embezzlement. Charges against the chief include accusations of giving donations to non-profit foundations in exchange for government favours. Several hundred Israeli settlers have blocked a row of red-top houses as Israeli security personnel were deployed to enforce evictions. The illegal settlements were built on privately owned Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank area. Earlier in the programme, we found out how introducing species can help restore the environment. Now let's look at when it goes wrong. Throughout history, some well-intentioned people have taken animals and plants into new parts of the world with disastrous effects. Here's a few notable examples. One of the worst examples of a species being introduced occurred when cane toads, which are native to South and mainland Middle America, were introduced to Australia. This was in 1935. The poisonous toads were originally introduced to try and control the grey-backed cane beetle, which was eating sugarcane crops. However, shortly after their arrival, it became apparent the cane toads couldn't jump very high, and so couldn't actually reach the beetles they were supposed to be eating. In this map, you can see just how far the toads spread over 40 years in Australia. It's estimated there are now more than 1.5 billion toads in the country, with the authorities completely at a loss as to how to control the numbers. Another example of unintended consequences is a freshwater fish called the Nile perch, which was introduced into Lake Victoria in Central Africa in the 1950s to boost the fishing industry. In just 50 years, the Nile perch caused an ecological disaster of biblical proportions, wiping out 90% of the other native fish called the cichlid. And it's not just animals introduced. Plants can also have a disastrous effect. The kudzu plant was introduced into the United States from Japan in the late 1800s to try and combat soil erosion. But kudzu kills or damages other plants by smothering them under a blanket of leaves. The plant encircles stems and tree trunks and breaks branches. It can even uproot entire trees, and it can grow at the remarkable rate of 25 centimetres each day. Well, still with me is David Hone, lecturer in zoology, specialising in ecology at Queen Mary, University of London. We humans are not perfect at this, are we, David?
No, we're generally pretty bad at it, though I think the good news is, with all the examples you've just highlighted, is most of them happened quite a long time ago. I mean, I'm not aware of any particular examples from the last 20 years
We've learned our lessons in the last few decades.
We certainly have, and, you know, lots of countries, in Australia as a prime example, the cane toad is one of a myriad of disastrous introductions, where they now have very strict border controls about plants, vegetables, insects, and all kinds of other things to prevent anything really getting any worse.
You need something that's going to attack the toads, don't you?
Well, you need something that's going to attack the toads, but that's also not going to make the situation worse and potentially transfer to other species, because there's lots of other native amphibians in South America, in Australia. So you can't just introduce a toad killer and hope and expect that it's just going to kill the toad. I mean, this is exactly the mistake that was made introducing it in the first place. Oh, these toads eat beetles, so when we put them there, they'll just eat beetles. And of course, they just ate everything, because that's what they do in the wild. And there were lots of things that were easier to eat than beetles.
There's a reason why the toads were found in America and were not found in Australia. That's the simple conclusion, isn't it? You know, development of animals and human beings and everything else, and the ecology of these places is what it is.
Yeah, everything develops potentially in isolation, and when you're talking about cross-continental boundaries, it's perhaps inevitable that these
mistakes will occur.
Well, these mistakes will occur. I mean, the funny thing is that a lot of these are actually very rare. It's relatively hard for a species to be introduced to a truly novel environment and do well. Mostly they do very badly. There's this thing called the rule of tens, which is much more flexible than that, but on average, for every 10 things that are introduced, only one actually survives and and becomes established in the population and becomes a local species. And of those, only about 1 in 10 become a pest species. So you actually need to introduce a few hundred before any of them start to become a real problem. The problem is when that does happen, it can be an absolute colossal ecological disaster.
Because once you've done the introduction and then leave nature, like, for instance, a breeding program, of course, you then can't control it anymore. Unlike those fish, for instance. I mean, they needed a few of them. They got hundreds of millions of them.
Once they get out of control, and if you're not monitoring it, and again, in the 50s, 40s, and even earlier, people weren't monitoring this stuff at all, and they had no interest or were attempting to monitor it. And of course, even a simple, small pilot study up front might have told them the kind of problems that were coming. I think that a large part of this is a more innocent age, if very badly handled.
Yeah, so science is more sophisticated, I suppose, about being able to model what might happen if you do this and this, then what's the that?
Oh, certainly, but I think, remember, it wasn't the scientists who were often introducing these things, or the scientists weren't necessarily consulted when it happened, otherwise some lessons may have been learned. I mean, people only needed to look around. Rabbits had been a colossal problem in Australia for 70, 80 years at this point, so it should have been obvious, you would hope to the authorities, that letting loose a new species without checking what it might do first should have been a fairly obvious issue, given the ludicrous amounts of money they'd spent building rabbit-proof fences across the whole continent and still failing to stop them.
You talked about the rule of 10, so there's some kind of, mathematical formula been developed.
It's not really a mathematical formula so much as on average when we look at it, we know it's about 1 in 10.
Been developed just about how these things work. Is there a sort of rule of how each species has to be in terms of its size, in terms of its opportunity, in terms of its diet, in terms of the supplies for it and water availability, in order that it then lives with appropriate numbers of who kills whom and whom eats whom?
Well, we certainly know on average which species are going to tend to do better. So, for example, things that are generalists, things that can eat almost anything, are very tolerant of temperature, food, water resources, etc., will tend to be better at establishing themselves, because it basically doesn't matter where you dump them or where they get out. They'll probably find somewhere they can live. Right. Whereas if, of course, they're extremely specialist and require a very narrow range of temperature and rainfall, etc., then one bad year and they're probably all wiped out almost instantly.
And does that sort of matter? I mean, obviously, scientifically, it's a shame that that species disappears.
Well, not if it's introduced and it's a problem. So, in terms of those that will become established, if we're trying to reintroduce things like we talked about in the first half, then obviously these are usually places where they had done well until very recently. They are adapted to those environments. But in terms of things basically escaping or being introduced artificially, if there's a mistake if well-meaning, understanding the environmental conditions are going to be a huge part to play.
But as part of our sort of looking after the planet and a stewardship of that, if some rather eclectic little animal or insect or something disappears from the Amazonian rainforest where it doesn't exist anywhere else and doesn't appear to have any impact on anywhere else, does that matter?
I think it does. Again, you're right, curation of the planet, curation of the natural resources and biodiversity, I think it's a shame when anything goes extinct. If you want to take the economic look at that, a huge percentage of our drugs and newly developed medicines ultimately actually come from plants and to a lesser degree animals. If you've wiped out entire species before you even knew they existed, who knows what you've potentially lost.
Good thought on which to end. David Hearn, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We end our programme with the Insight Bite. This is a little something that we feel you should know. And today it's a 93-million-year-old marine reptile. This well-preserved, complete skeleton was found in 2011 in the arid desert area of Mexico, a part of the world that was once a giant sea whale. It's been particularly useful to scientists as it's revealed details of tissues and scales that are unseen in other fossils. Christened the Mariosaurus fernandezi, it's thought to have been around 2 meters long and had a flipper span of about 2.5 meters. Mexico is a prime stamping ground for paleontologists in search of dinosaurs because today's climate and accompanying erosion is frequently uncovering evidence of prehistoric life. And that's it from me for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.